This is an analysis of Inside the Island by Nowra, Act 1, Scene 1. We begin with about 3 lines of stage directions. However, unless the question asks for the phrase stage directions, we do not use those words. We use other words, the other dramatic conventions, rather than a very general stage directions. So let's begin. Night. So that's telling us about the temporal setting, the sound of bullfrogs and a creek. Look at the set description. We are introduced to a world. What kind of world is it? Who occupies it? It seems to be a rural area. We know that this is in northwestern New South Wales in 1912 and in the Australian outback, perhaps. Sounds of nature. George enters drunk. For a man to be drunk is an Australian stereotype, and we are in a very Australian setting. He carries an unopened bottle of whiskey wrapped in a newspaper. He stops and wonders where he should go now. So the whiskey, the fact that George is drunk, reminds us of an Australian stereotype. George says, "Let's see," pointing upstage. "The creek's there," the motioning downstage. "Another mile. It's taking a long time tonight. Perhaps I passed out. She'll be furious," and he sets off again. So there's a she. Who is this she? We're going to find out in a little while. She'll be furious. So he is thinking about a woman being angry, and he seems a little scared of a woman being angry, which tells us something about the relationship between this man and this woman, and what makes a woman angry. But let's see what we learn later off. Peter is off stage singing. "Oh, while I was shearing, I used to dream that the old rouseabout was a girl, the prettiest girl in the whole wide world." George is startled. "Who's there?" Now George seems to be a little bit scared. He's easily scared. He's scared of a woman, she'll be furious, and he's scared of someone singing a song. Peter, still off stage, continues singing. "Her slippers were made of crystal, her combs were made from the finest gold." Look at the words of this song. It's making something very plain, very glorified. Slippers, something very plain, made very glorified crystal. Her combs, something very plain, made of the finest gold. So it's glorifying very ordinary, everyday, mundane things. But George is a bit scared. He asks short, sharp questions. "Who's there? Answer me." So we're already getting a sense of a man who is afraid. He's a typical Australian man in the sense that he's drunk, but he's also afraid of a woman and afraid of a stranger singing a song, which is not very traditionally masculine. He turns in the direction of the singing, trips over a tree trunk, and sprawls on the ground. Shit! So he's obviously not very sure-footed on the ground either, which is another traditional male stereotype he is not conforming to. But his swearing is Australian stereotype, that Australians tend to swear a lot. And of course, we also have the notion that people who swear are thought less of by society. Peter's still off stage. "And though she didn't look more than 16, I knew she was over 100 years old." This is a metaphorical reference to Australia and Australians. Even though he seems to be singing about a girl, the prettiest girl in the whole wide world, we can relate it to Australia, who is seen as a young country, especially when this is set in 1912. But really, this land is old and ancient, and people have lived here for generations. So we can find different levels of meaning in this text if we think of the context and if we apply our knowledge and our concepts from the course. So while it seems to be referring to a girl, it's actually referring to Australia. So look at the metaphorical reference. Now George is conscious of the singing again. "Who's there?" And he's really scared with all these short questions that he's asking. All right. Let's go on to the next page, and he jumps up, frightened. "Who's there?" And he goes upstage. "Answer me." And Peter is still off stage, still singing. He's not bothered, but George is frightened. Oh, her teeth were capped with silver. Now the teeth are capped with silver, not as good as gold. It suggests something second class. And I'm pointing this out now because it will become important in a little while. George again asks, "Who's that singing? Answer me!" And he falls into the creek with a splash. Peter's still off stage. Now we've got a very clumsy George who's fallen into, very scared, very clumsy George who's fallen into the creek. And Peter sings, "And shone by the light of the moon as we danced a waltz to this tune." And George cannot swim properly. So he's with desperate splashing sounds. He goes, "Help, help, I can't swim." So he's not the conventional Australian man who is strong, who is unafraid, who is bold. He's not that. He's scared of a woman. He's scared of sounds and the darkness. He's scared of the darkness, and he can't swim. The only thing he can do is swear and drink. So Peter finally hears him. "Who's there? Hello? Here in the creek, help me." Peter enters with a kerosene lamp and goes upstage. "Here, help me. No, over this way, over here, I'm stuck." George is like a little child asking for help. Peter searches the ground for a stick and finds one. "Grab hold of this." He holds it out to George. Now George is still panicking. "My foot's caught in a snag." "Grab the stick." "I can't get free." "Grab the stick." And he pulls George onto the bank. Now it's very interesting. George here, as we've just seen, is defying the conventional traits of masculinity. He is being quite effeminate in how he's scared, he needs help, he falls down, he's crying out. And here we have another person, Peter, who doesn't seem to be afraid of the dark, who's singing a song about a girl. So someone very masculine and someone who doesn't panic and can help and can get George out. So one character is more masculine in this scene and one character is more traditionally feminine. It's also interesting that Peter takes the stick to get George out. A stick, therefore, becomes a phallic symbol representing masculinity. And of course, Peter is a masculine character there. So George, gasping and coughing, comes out and says, "Went in head first. My foot was caught." There's silence. Peter waits for George to recover. George sits up. He shakes his head. Now he's a little bit embarrassed. So he goes, "Fancy nearly drowning in a creek. Thanks, And he slaps his wet clothes. "Where's my bottle of whiskey?" Now he's feeling a little bit less of a man, or he doesn't want Peter to think he's any less of a man. So what does a real man do when he's caught in an embarrassing situation? He wants a drink. And so George asks for his drink. "Where's my whiskey?" He stands up and prepares to go back into the creek. "I must have dropped it in the creek." And Peter says, "Hold on, I've just pulled you out." And George says, "No, I remember. I fell over a log, over there." And he goes downstage with Peter, and he goes, "There it is." So he unscrews it and he takes a drink. "Nearly drowned in a bloody creek. Christ, you want some?" Now George is trying to recover his masculinity. So not only does he drink, he also swears twice, bloody creek and Christ. So he's trying to live up to what it traditionally means to be a man and an Australian man who swear and drink. Peter says, "No thanks." "Go on, you saved me. Go on, it'll cool you down." Peter takes a sip. Note the reference to "it'll cool you down," which suggests that it's very hot. Now keep an eye on any references to the heat, because all these references will become very, very important as we read on. Not bad, is it? Pretty good. "God, it's hot tonight." And there's another reference to the heat. That's the second one we have. "Nice and cool in the creek." Someone's remembering. Someone was singing. Before I fell in, someone was singing. It was me. Gave me a bit of a shock. I was singing with my squeeze box. "What are you doing here?" "I live here." "Here?" "Just over there in that bunch of trees." But George says, but this is my land. The creek too? And George says, everything. I own as far as you can see, nearly up to those hills. All the flat land around here and the wheat fields are mine. So's the mill, everything. George takes another drink. Silence. Now again, George is trying to reassert himself. We can also see the beginnings of a class difference here. That George is, because this land belongs to him, he's of a higher class. So there's a socio-economic difference between Peter and George. Peter says, you want me to shift? Shift? I've got a hut here. George is incredulous. A hut? How long have you lived here? Peter says, a couple of weeks. So George, for someone who owns a lot of land, he doesn't even know when someone is living there or squatting there. Peter is a bit of a squatter, a little Aussie battler stereotype, if you like. But George doesn't even realize he's been living there all this while. But this is my land. No wonder I was surprised. No one comes here. And he takes another drink. No one. He hands the bottle to Peter. I've been down at the pub. I'm on my way home. See that light over there? That's my home. So again, he's trying to show he's very manly because he's been down at the pub. I see you during the day. I wondered who owned such a big house. Well, now you know. You want me to leave here? Well, I got a surprise. That's why. You're the first person that ever lived here. Let's go there. That's why I fell in the creek. I'm not doing any harm. I just live in my hut and play music. I'll be moving soon. Pause. I haven't thanked you for saving me. What's your name? Pete. Peter Blackwood. Mine's George. Do you want to see my hut, seeing it's on your land? They go upstage, Peter holding his lantern. But why are you living in a hut? The only place I've got. You got any money? No. You can have a job as one of my workers. You want a job? I don't care. But you need the money. I'd like to think I can always help people. Well, the hut will have to be torn down. Peter shrugs. It's your land. You can live with one of my workers. Pause. Peter picks up his squeeze box. So we have George again trying to assert his authority, this time not through masculinity, but by class and wealth. So it's his land. The hut will have to be torn down. I can offer you a job and be your boss. I can pay you money. You need the money. And of course, I always want to help people. Let me help people. So Peter says, I sing with this. A concertina. No, it's a squeeze box. Could you play it? George shakes his head. I love music, but can't play a thing. But he's fairly useless, this George, isn't he? Peter sings, oh, while I was shearing, I used to dream that the old rouseabout was a girl. And of course, shearing, a very traditional Aussie thing to do, is to shear sheep. Pretty good, eh? You know any others? Hundreds. He wipes his brow and slaps a mosquito on his arm. It's hot tonight. And there we have another reference to the heat. Wiping his brow and saying it's hot tonight. So look at his action there, his movement. Slaps a mosquito on his arm. He's tough. He's not worried about mozzies biting him. George says, you should jump in the creek. That'll cool you down. Trying to make it sound as if he actually jumped into the creek to cool down and didn't trip and fall in. So we can see we're learning different things about these characters from their different perspectives about land and ownership. So there's a bit of a pause. And George says, play a song. You want to hear some? And George mimics Peter. Hundreds. Peter takes a sip of the whiskey and says, help me sing. George, taking the bottle from Peter and drinking, helps me listen. All right, let's have it. This one is called Big Black Jack. Ever heard of it? George shakes his head. First one I learned in my squeeze box, Big Black Jack. Now this is an important song. Big Black Jack was always fighting, so they threw him out of the pub. So angry was he that he lit a bit fart and blew the pub apart. Oh, Big Black Jack. Sudden blackout. So Big Black Jack, it's interesting that it's Big Black Jack. We'll come to that later. And see that he was thrown out of the pub and he got revenge by a huge big fart. Now this becomes symbolic later, so we'll talk about this later. But tell me, what do his songs tell us about his character? What kind of a person is he? And how is he different to George in the things he sings about, the things he says and does? Notice also the sudden blackout. And notice how it's a big contrast to what was before with light and talking, and there's a sudden blackout. It's not the light is not fading away, it's sudden. And these become important. So think about what you can say about the lighting, the props, the movement, the body language and action, yes, the dialogue too, the setting, the sound. All of these are very important dramatic conventions, and it's far better to use these words than it is to say the same old boring stage directions. Okay, now we begin scene 2, and it begins in darkness, and you can hear, so before you see anything, you can hear someone plays Elgar's Imperial March on the piano. Very interesting. Compare the music at the beginning of scene 1. What cultural associations are evoked by the music in the previous scene and the music in this scene? So we have in scene 1 very light-hearted, carefree music and songs, a little bit vulgar. And then suddenly we have Elgar's Imperial March being played on the piano before the lights come on. This is the music that was played at Queen Victoria's coronation. So both these pieces of music evoke very different things, and they're symbolic. So lights come up slowly on Susan Dawson at the piano in the living room. 2 soldiers enter, Captain Henry and Sergeant Collins, followed by Lillian Dawson. The soldiers stand uneasily as the music is played. At the end of the piece, both men, not knowing what to do on such occasions, applaud. So this is a very different scene that we come to. We've already heard how the sound and the music are different, but look at the setting, look at the way people are standing. They're also different. 2 soldiers standing, listening. They're uneasy in this place. There's a piano in a living room. Very different scene to the previous very Australian scene. This is not authentically Australian, this scene. Let's see why. Let's read on. And let's see what we learn about the people who inhabit this place. So Lillian says, "Susan, this is Captain Henry and Sergeant Collins. How do you do?" "I'm very well, thank you." "That was pretty good playing." "I wasn't playing." "Excuse me, it's a pianola." "Oh, I see. So a pianola is something which has a pre-recorded tune and it plays that. It's not someone actually playing the piano. So again, a pianola is something second class. Remember we had the silver-capped teeth in the previous scene? Again, something which is second class, something which is not high class or first class. And again, we have someone putting on a front, pretending to be something they're not, pretending to play the piano when in fact they're not. So Lillian, Susan's mother, and as we find out later, George's wife, says, "Unfortunately, there are no piano teachers here. We hope she will be able to take lessons later on this year. You look uncomfortable, gentlemen. Please sit. Sit down. My husband will be home soon. Would you like some refreshments? We have alcohol and lemonade. I don't drink alcohol." So note Lillian's actions and dialogue. What are your first impressions of Lillian? And this is a good place to pause and come back and think about what your impressions of her are. She's just said, "Well, we have alcohol and lemonade. I don't drink alcohol." And the captain says, "Oh, I'm a teetotaler too." A teetotaler is someone who doesn't drink alcohol. "In the army and not a drinker. You must be unique." So she doesn't have a very high opinion of the army, does she? And she's quite bossy. Notice how she orders the gentleman, "Please sit down," even though they look uncomfortable. So she's a little bit bossy, seems to be quite controlling as well. Captain responds, just about. My father was a non-drinker. Well, that explains it. And then she turns to the sergeant. I suspect you're not a teetotaler. So notice the derogatory manner in which she speaks to the sergeant. I don't think you're going to avoid alcohol. I'm guessing you're going to have the alcohol. The sergeant says, I enjoy a glass now and then. And it's then now? So she's quite catty. Susan, a decanter of sherry for the sergeant and a jug of lemonade for us. It's interesting that it is sherry that she serves because sherry is a middle-class English drink. Lillian sits. Lovely house. Why, thank you. My father built it 40 years ago. He was a great man. When he first came here, it was just bush, a huge plain of aboriginals and gum trees. He got rid of the blacks, except for those whom he converted, removed the gum trees. His picture is on the wall, painted by a very talented Aboriginal youth who died soon after. Ah, refreshment. We learned something about Lillian and her values and her family in this little monologue. It gives us some background about Lillian's family and her character. Notice how she calls her father a great man. And why is he great? Because he got rid of Aboriginal people and anything that was authentically Australian. Gum trees, traditional Australian trees. So he got rid of them, and that is why she thinks he is so great. Notice also that in the same line as bush and gum trees, she talks about Aboriginal people. So she is dehumanizing the Aboriginal people here and equating them to things found in nature. So this tells us about her views towards our First Nations people. Notice also how she refers to them as the blacks and how complacently she talks about a very talented Aboriginal youth who died soon after. So she has stripped away, or her father has stripped away anything that was authentically Australian, whether it be fauna, whether it be people. And that is what makes her father great. So are we positioned to like or dislike Lillian? I think we're positioned to dislike Lillian because we already see her being quite controlling, and because from our early 21st century Australian perspective, with our view on First Nation people's rights, we also disapprove of the way she's speaking. So Susan enters with the tray. Our cook is away at the moment. Sherry for the sergeant. Notice how, because her daughter Susan has entered with the tray, she has to point out that it's the cook who usually cooks and serves, again showing the class structures that exist here. Susan pours the sherry from a decanter. Lemonade for 3, and gives a glass of lemonade to Captain Henry. 1 lemonade? Thank you. And the sergeant says to Susan, Thank you, miss. Ah, nice and cold, and she sips the lemonade. So refreshing on a night like this. Again, another reference to the heat. Highlight or underline all the references to heat in this play because they become very, very important. Captain, it's excellent. Homemade. And Lillian is stunned by the sight of the sergeant downing his sherry in one gulp. Nice, sergeant? So there's a bit of a sarcastic tone here. Sergeant says, Lovely. Generally, I don't like sherry. It gives me a pain in the guts. Sergeant! Huh? And he understands that he shouldn't have used the word guts in front of a lady. Sorry, missus. It gives me a pain in the tummy. But this is lovely. Help yourself, Sergeant. I'm sure you'll need no prompting. Again, notice her sarcastic tone. The sergeant does so, however. He doesn't recognize her sarcastic tone. And Lillian says, My husband should not be too long. That's all right. We're in no hurry. It seems strange to me that the army should suddenly start sending men up here. They don't know if it'll be a regular thing yet. We're quite a small outfit, 50 men. And only you 2 are officers? Sergeant Collins is not quite an officer yet. My lieutenant left by rail this morning to go back to Sydney to fix up our supplies. So it makes us wonder, why are there soldiers in this area? So how long will you be staying here? A month all told. Intense? That's half the exercise, roughing it. I don't know if you know the area where we're camped. Oh, yes. When I was a girl, I dried out there on my school holidays. My father gave it to the government just before he died. It's interesting, right now, and in that little monologue we discussed earlier, we learn that the land actually belonged to Lillian's father. But George can call it his land because he married Lillian, and so anything that a woman had became the property of her husband. But the interesting thing here is that Lillian's father gave the land to the government just before he died. Why did he give it as a gift? When do rich people give the government presents? Do they mean it as a bribe, as special favors? The captain said, as a gift? Lillian nods. Just a straight out gift. He had a good sense of the magnanimous gesture. More lemonade? It's a little bit ironic because we can't really see it as a magnanimous gesture, especially knowing how he treated the Aboriginal people there. No, thank you. Lillian looks with distaste at the sergeant's heavy drinking. Are you on fire, Sergeant? Huh? Your intake would seem to suggest you were. So she's commenting on the amount that the sergeant is drinking. So again, this reinforces her portrayal as somewhat of a control freak. I was thirsty. Do you want some water? Sergeant says, no, thank you. The sergeant pours his third glass of sherry. Realizing he has been ill-mannered, he pours the sherry back into the decanter. Oh dear. He then returns to his chair with an empty glass. Oh dear. Poor sergeant. That's not going to win him any points, isn't it? Is it? It's so comforting, Lillian says, to know that the army is here. Oh, I don't mean protection for me personally, but the knowledge that the army is doing something. We're so isolated. Australia is like a giant sloth. It doesn't seem to realize that there are 800 million Asiatics eyeing us with envy. Well, well, well. So, what do we learn about Lillian? Well, she's racist and xenophobic. And she doesn't think much of Australia. She thinks, and as we'll find out, anything that's British is much better. So she has what we call the cultural cringe. That anything that's authentically Australia can never be enough as to what is more British, or in modern times, American. But why do you think Lillian needs protection? She says it's comforting to know the army is here. What is it she needs protection from? What is she afraid of? Is there something in the Australian land that she's afraid of? Anyway, so the captain says, if needed, I think you'll find us awake. And Lillian says, I hope so. What am I saying? Of course you will be. Your men will be. I worry, perhaps unnecessarily, but everything seems exaggerated out here. The loneliness, the isolation, and remember everything we've learned about the Australian Gothic genre here. When I was young, a Chinaman came to our front door and begged for some money. My father gave him a few coins, and when the Chinaman smiled as thanks, I saw his teeth were gold, all of them. They caught the sun, and it looked as if his whole face were ablaze. Imagine that, walking around begging when he held a fortune in his mouth. That's their mentality, their duplicity. We can see her very xenophobic and racist attitudes here. There's a pause. I wonder where my husband could be. I told him to be home at 7. It's a long walk from the mill. Oh, it slipped my mind. Biscuits? Notice how she's quite controlling of her husband as well. She told him to be here at a certain time. So she opens up a musical box and it plays a tune. Think about this musical box. It is very symbolic as well. And she says, I bought it when a young girl in England. So she's reminding the captain and the sergeant that she has British connections. That's where she's from. She's better than Australia, which is like a giant sloth, as she has said. Her cultural cringe is already coming through. Thank you, the captain says, and captain takes one biscuit. The sergeant, however, takes 3 biscuits and says ta. So there's a class difference between the captain and the sergeant. One is more informal and casual than the other, and he has no manners, whereas the captain is more refined and educated. So we're seeing a class difference in this play. And we'll talk about these later in more detail. Lillian, of course, hasn't missed that the sergeant has taken that, and she mocks him a bit more. Have you been in the army all your life, Sergeant? The sergeant doesn't get the sarcasm. And he says, no, I used to work as a miner, but the mine ran out of coal, so I joined the army. At least with the army, you get regular food and pay. And Lillian, again sarcastic, well, I don't know what that says about our army. But the sergeant is confused, so she says, but I'm sure it's something good. It was near the sea. Excuse me? The mine was near the sea, on the coast. I like the sea. Perhaps you should have joined the Navy. I get seasick. Still, it's a job. It's more than a job, isn't it? You have to fight. Fight? I guess so. Have you ever been in a battle? A real one? No, missus. I did see a man run over by one of those new mechanical plows last year. He was chewed up something bad. I guess a battlefield is a bit like that. What a morbid imagination you have. Perhaps we should go. It's getting late. Let's have a look at this monologue of Lillian's. I can't understand where Mr. Dawson could be. Perhaps a few more minutes. While we're waiting, I'll show you my indoor garden, Captain. It's in the conservatory. Susan, entertain the sergeant while we're gone. This way, Captain. My fuchsias are famous throughout the whole district. So there are a few ways to interpret this little dialogue. And certainly fuchsias are British cottage plants. They're not authentically Australian. Therefore, they have to be kept in an indoor garden in the conservatory. And so, again, it's something that's been imposed upon Australia. And I think we have realized by now that Lillian represents Britain or Britannia. And she values and venerates anything that is British and deplores anything that is Australian. So we can see her cultural cringe for Australia, and we can see how much she prefers anything that is British. So whereas her family got rid of the gum trees, she likes the fuchsias. But there is another more sexual interpretation of this, a more Freudian interpretation perhaps. An indoor garden could refer to Lillian's private areas, and a fuchsias perhaps can be interpreted to refer to female genitals, which have often been likened to flowers. And of course, she's trying to draw the captain away. So is something going on when she tells the captain, let me show you my indoor garden, but leaves the sergeant behind? Your choice, however you want to interpret it. So Susan says, do you want a biscuit? Yes, please. And Susan, with distaste, says, help yourself. So we can see that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, that Susan is very much like her mother. Sergeant says ta and opens the music box quite roughly. Susan says, careful. Sergeant says, sorry, and he examines it as it plays Silent Night. Hello, it's just a little spring here. All it needs is just a push. Right as rain. Taking out 3 biscuits, he gives the music box to Susan, who has held out her hand for it. She inspects it glumly, even though it still works. Nice biscuits. You make them? The cook did. I can't cook. Again, we can see the class difference. It's easy. You'll get the hang of it. My mum was a great cook. Cooked for 6 boys. This is followed by an awkward silence, and Susan attempts some conversation. Do you like the country around here? A bit flat. I like mountains. I thought you liked the sea. I like the mountains and the sea. There's a bit of a pause. Some lemonade? No thanks. Not too keen on it. None of me family were. We called it sugar syrup. So look at the difference in the kind of language used by the sergeant and by captain. There's a difference in there, tells us more of education and class and background. Susan says sarcastically, I'm sorry we have nothing better. Sergeant again misses the sarcasm and says, that's all right. The silence continues. The sergeant is restless. Finally, he takes out a dirty sock from his pocket and makes it into a hand puppet. That's very interesting. So the sergeant says with a squeaky voice, "Hello, Susie." Susan turns and notices the hand puppet. She is astonished. "It's a nice day, isn't it? My, what a big girl you are. I see you're surprised. My friend Sergeant Collins keeps me in his pocket all nice and cozy, and when I'm awake, I come out to play. Oh, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Jono. Hello, Susie. Aren't you going to say hello to me?" Again, we can interpret this in two ways. On the one hand, it's rather patronizing, treating a grown-up girl like as if she was a child. But it's also rather sleazy. When you're talking about a toy that he keeps nice and cozy in his pocket, and when he wakes up, it comes out to play. That again, we have some sexual connotations there. And this is further reinforced by calling that puppet Jono. If you're not sure what is meant by Jono or Johnson, then Google it. Susan says, "Sergeant, I'm 17 years old, not 10. "Sorry." To the socket says, "Good night, Jono." And in a squeaky voice, "Good night, Clarence." And he puts away the sock. The kids down at the mill like him. "I'm sure they do. Good night, Sergeant." "Good night, Miss Dawson." And Susan leaves in a huff. In a squeaky voice, we hear, "Nighty-night, Susie." It's all very sleazy. All right, now look at these long instructions here. Let's see. The sergeant doesn't know what to do. He looks around the room. Making sure he is not being watched, he opens the music box and steals a handful of biscuits. Then he picks up the decanter of sherry and drinks greedily from it, straight from the bottle. He looks at the level of liquid and, seeing that he may have drunk too much, pours lemonade into the decanter up to the previous level. Listening to the music box tune, he carries the box over to the piano. After placing the box on the piano top, he begins to pedal the piano. While he is playing and eating at the same time, Lillian and Captain Henry enter. So what do we learn about the sergeant's character from these, and how he does not belong in this world? He is incongruous in this world. It's a place where he doesn't belong. Lillian and Captain Henry come back, and we don't know what they've been up to while they've been gone. Lillian says, "Susan not here?" Oh, and of course, remember how he's filled up the sherry with lemonade, and that becomes important because we'll come back to that later. Sergeant almost chokes on his biscuit. "No, missus. She went to bed. She told me to make myself at home before she went. Always wanted to play the piano." And Lillian asks again sarcastically, "More sherry, Sergeant?" And the sergeant returns to his chair. "No thanks. I only drink it in moderate amounts." It's a bit of humour for us because we know that's not the case. So Lillian talks then. Susan was probably tired. She's been a rather busy girl lately. She leaves for England very soon. I can well imagine how excited she is. When my father sent me to England, I could hardly sleep on the voyage over. And when I saw England, everywhere I looked, I could hardly believe my eyes. Green, green, green. Everything so green it hurt my eyes. She pauses. So what does Lillian's monologue reveal about her values and her attitudes, and how she feels about England as compared to Australia? We can see her cultural cringe. She values the green of England and not the beautiful colours of the Australian landscape. Remember that her family got rid of the gum trees, etc. And remember the saying that the grass is always greener on the other side. Pause. I wonder where my husband is. Maybe he's still at the mill, some problem or other. And she gestures. All this is his in name only. He got it all by marrying me. He knows nothing about flour or wheat. To be honest, he's a bit lost out here. It gives him something to do to go and talk with the workers at the mill. My father wanted a son, naturally, but got a daughter. And when a woman marries, she signs over everything to her husband automatically. Don't you think that's odd? In reality, if not in theory, I own all the land, the flour mill, the village. Except for the hired hands, everyone of working age works in my mill. I am, I suppose you could say, a mandarin. Is that the right word? What is a female mandarin called? She looks at Captain Henry and then at the sergeant. So, we have here Lillian explaining how the land came to be in her husband's name. But notice how arrogant she is, and she's bragging about the land and about her class and her wealth. She's also being instructed as a monstrous feminine, someone who's overbearing and arrogant, someone who's very controlling and bossy. So we are still being positioned to dislike her. An orange, says the sergeant. Is your sergeant's stupidity feigned? It was a joke. Oh, then it wasn't feigned. It wasn't being pretending. And she spots a large leather-bound book, which is again symbolic. Ah, just the thing. I was looking at it just before you arrived, and she picks it up. My visitor's book. Something very British again. I generally have it in the hallway. Not very impressive in the latter section, but earlier on there's some wonderful names. I've kept it since I was a girl. Look at her bragging here. My father was very famous, and a lot of famous people used to visit here. Look at the slightly indirect comparison of her husband and her father. She's very proud of her father. She's contemptuous of her husband. And we get a sense that things have gone down since her father was alive. So many wonderful names. She places the book on the table next to the writing equipment. I would be pleased if you would both sign in it. We'd be delighted. They rise and go to the table. I'll get the blotting paper. She exits. The sergeant and the captain sign the book. Lillian hurries back into the living room. So when you used to use quills or fountain pens, you had to blot the ink on blotting paper to make sure it didn't smudge when you were writing. It looks like my husband won't be back in time, so I'll tell him when he gets home that you've come, and also about the picnic cricket match. She goes to blot the book. What's this? Our signatures. This! Notice how confrontational Lillian is as well. My signature. It's an X! The sergeant looks embarrassed. I'm afraid Sergeant Collins has never been to school, Mrs. Dawson. But an X! Someone will think it's a joke. There are no other X's in my book. We see Lillian's snobbery here. I'm sorry, Mrs. The page will have to be torn out. Perhaps I can use some sort of erasure. Heavy footsteps are heard entering the house and stumbling. Is that you, George? No answer. Suddenly, George appears in the doorway, dirty, wet, and swaying with drunkenness. I fell in the creek. He collapses onto the floor and blackout. So here Lillian is trying to set up and create an order in her world. And then George enters and all the order in her world is disrupted. What is the significance of this? Outside her home, it's all Australian land with the bush and the creek, etc. But inside, she's made it very British, very Victorian, and she's trying to impose a sense of order on the landscape. What do you think will happen to this order later?